We have this lecture thanks to Robert Campbell, who was the leader, wait a minute, I'm going to get the wrong title, president, I think, of PPL before his death, and his bequest created the endowment for the Campbell Lecture Series. And so we are most happy to be able to present distinguished speakers like Diana Butler Bass, who bring us issues of great significance and help bring us together across those theological divides. So, Larry, do you want to continue with an introduction of our speaker?
Well, you know, after last night, I think we should say we're grateful that you're here. And I say that because she has a busy schedule, and you could have easily said no, but we're glad that you said yes. And we have been fed by you last evening, and I know that you will bring us something that will give us sustenance today. So let me just say that we at the Lehigh Conference of Churches are very proud to have you here, Diana, and look forward to your sharing with us. Blessings.
Thank you so much. Just about 3 days ago, after I'd come back from California, I realized I had preached every single weekend of Lent, and many times during the week as well, having led retreats and preached at special Lenten events. And so I put up on Twitter, is there such a thing as death by Lent? Because I am not ordained, that means we are now heading towards, those of us who are Christians are heading towards Palm Sunday, which means I now get off and it's up to you guys. So I wish all of you who are celebrating over the next 2 weeks just a glorious and amazing time. And I hope that this feeds you as you go into this really amazing, powerful time of the year. I have with me something I did not pass around last night. I just kind of forgot. This is a sign up for my newsletter. It's called The Cottage. It comes out at most twice a month. I think I'm supposed to get it out this Saturday. I hope I do. So that's tomorrow, isn't it? Oh my gosh. So what I do in The Cottage is I usually write a short piece. Sometimes it tests out ideas that I'm planning on using in upcoming books. I put in resources like poems that attract my attention, things that I think that my friends might like, and of course there's my event calendar and information as well about books or other things that my publisher would like me to put in it. People really like it. There's a guy who considers himself the theologian, the crank theologian on Twitter, and he is tough as nails. He's an upper Midwestern guy, working class kind of pastor, and he says that he loves The Cottage because it's the nicest newsletter he gets. And it reminds him that there's a different side of faith besides him being the crank theologian. So that pleases me enormously, that the crank theologian thinks that my words contribute to kindness and generosity in the world. So if you'd like that, you can go ahead and put your name here. Please know I do not abuse the privilege. I am horrified when I get too much email. And of course, I never sell or share the list with anyone. So the purple clipboard is coming around. Fill out your email as you like, or just let it pass you by. If you don't want to do that, you can stay in touch with me via Twitter. How many people are on Twitter? Oh my gosh, it never fails to amaze me how many mainline type pastors are not on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, follow me, please. You will find there, I am working to both have a powerful political voice, but also a powerfully generous voice. And so on Twitter, I'm both political and nice. So it is. It's a paradox. So are you a Lutheran? Lutherans always love that paradox thing. So you can follow me on Twitter, or you can follow my public Facebook page, which is just under my name, Diana Butler Bass. I don't know if there's any other way you can follow me. I have a website, so you can look up stuff there. So I love social media, actually. Not so bad for a 60-year-old woman. So I want to go on today by following up with the question that I left last night. How many people only have come this morning? Okay, so I'll catch you all up. Last night I shared about my latest book, which is called Grateful. And I think that if last night's lecture had a title, it probably would be called Gratitude, It's Not What You Think, or Gratefulness, Much More Than a Greeting Card. Because this project, writing about this particular spiritual practice, has been a surprise to me by the depth and the power of gratitude as not just a spiritual practice for our own lives, whereby we become better by practicing gratitude, but the possibility that gratitude holds out to be a social or communal practice that makes us all better as community and as the body politic. I suppose the best way of capturing the thesis was making the point that was in one of the slides, is that gratitude is good for us as individuals. And if that is indeed the case, is gratitude good for us as community? What would it look like to really have grateful communities? Because of my work in the past, I'm really interested in the idea of gratitude as a congregational practice. What would that look like? But I'm also interested in the larger question that I think is bedeviling us all right now, is could we potentially even have a politics of gratitude? And what would that look like? So today, I landed here, last night. One of the sorts of problems we have about gratitude is there's a deep conflict in Western imagination about the nature of gratitude. And that conflict is, on one side, we will often define gratitude as an obligation or a debt, as a transaction based on gifts. I give you something, and then you're required to do something in return. That idea of indebtedness comes from a whole bunch of very ancient sources, particularly the definitions of gratitude itself as it emerged around 2,000 years ago in the ancient Roman Empire. The Roman economic system actually was referred to as a gratus system, based on higher status people doing things for lower status people, and lower status people in turn owing their complete loyalty and allegiance to the patron who had given them gifts. That system, that economic system, was the fundamental glue of the Roman Empire. And it was called the gratus system, whereby grace and favor came down from the rich, and then the poor gave back up their gratitude to those who had taken care of them. That vision of gratitude as an up and down transaction of wealth and really control of the masses, because it was an economic system that was geared to keep the poor in place in the ancient Roman world. Jesus is constantly questioning that system all throughout the New Testament. And so that kind of vision of gratitude as obligation, as debt, as hierarchy, and as control really sort of haunts Western people. It's all over the place. I mentioned last night, have you ever said the phrase, I owe you a debt of gratitude? If you've said that, you are echoing language that is 2,000 years old and repeating a sort of mantra that people used to say in the ancient Roman Empire. Now, Jesus envisioned a whole different idea of gratitude. He proclaimed all the time gratitude as a table. And indeed, he was constantly coming after ideas about if you got a gift, you owed somebody something in return, and that it was not a hierarchical arrangement. My favorite verse comes out of Luke 14, where Jesus says, I tell you, when you give a dinner or a luncheon, do not invite your rich friends, your rich neighbors, and your relatives, that they might repay you. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, and the lame, so they will not repay you. It's really Jesus coming right at the idea of quid pro quo, that we do something in order to get something in return. Occasionally someone will say to me, hey, but the end of the verse says you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And I always like pointing out that that is a little Jesus joke. Part of the problem about Christianity is when we don't understand when Jesus is telling a joke. And what he's saying when he says, oh, you know, do this because they cannot repay you because you can be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous, he's basically saying, oh, you'll get your repayment so far in the future from now that by the time it happens, you will not even remember this particular dinner. And so Jesus is really unhinging the idea of giving something in order to get something in return. And if you start having that lens when you come to Scripture, it's really interesting to see how Jesus is constantly challenging any kind of hierarchical pyramid structure of gifts as transaction, and instead is undermining that whole system of Roman economy by offering the idea of a table. Free food for everybody. In Jesus' universe, there is constant free lunch. And so what we have in Western culture are these two conflicting ideas about gratitude. One is a transaction of status, and the other is a table of community. And so the question I left everybody with last night is, which do you want to be part of? And it's been fascinating this Lent. I've kept this question front and center in all of the sermons that I've preached. This or this? This or this? And so the prodigal son, which we just had, if you follow the lectionary, that's actually a version of this. The elder brother believed that he deserved the father's gratitude because of all the stuff that he had done. Whereas the younger brother simply came home and threw himself on the father's mercy. And the father set a table with a feast. It was a transactional vision of gratitude versus a table vision of gratitude. So I think that this is actually a fundamental theme of the New Testament, and it's one that we don't pay nearly enough attention to. As a matter of fact, when I was writing the book, I was shocked. I found one theological book that was written exclusively about gratitude as a theological theme in the New Testament. It was written Grace and Gratitude, Brian Garish. So it came from the Presbyterian tradition. That was the only book that had gratitude as its main theological theme. I was actually shocked by that, and I'm still shocked by it, and I'm shocked to the level of thinking about how I'm going to continue to pursue this as a theological vision over the next few books that I write. So what I wanted to do is to keep going with this because I thought that this would really speak across the theological boundaries that we have, because not only is it a theme that is not exclusive to any one theological tradition of Christianity, it's a dominant theme in the New Testament that has been very poorly explored by the church and in preaching and in formal theology, but it's also a dominant theme in the Hebrew Bible. And so you can look backwards and see how this portrays itself. God is always really taking down pyramids of power in the Hebrew Bible, starting with the Tower of Babel and moving all the way through God protesting the idea of giving Israel a king. And every time a pyramid of power that's based on gifts and status like this shows up in the Hebrew scriptures, God says, this is unjust. Sends the prophets to speak against such arrangements. And instead, the dominant theological themes around gratitude in the Hebrew scriptures are those of Shabbat, Jubilee, and really, I think, the whole vision of a land that is overflowing with abundance, a land of milk and honey, to which the people come and they are simply gifted by God. God's great abundance overflows. So, transaction or table is a powerful theme throughout the Bible. And so I wanted to explore this with you this morning. I just put that on there because it was a nice slide while you were all eating. Meister Eckhart, just beautiful quote, "If the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, it would be enough." This is a picture of a banner that I saw just a few weeks ago. Good Shepherd United Church of Christ in Sahuarita, Arizona. Has anybody been there? Because that's the church that's been leading sort of clergy training on the border. Anybody been there? I once in a while run into somebody who has been. I highly recommend it. Every January they do a big clergy action training event, and people come to Tucson and they go down to the border and they see the border and they work with immigrants over the course of the week and talk about policies related to the border and all kinds of things. It's an astonishingly good church, and they have this huge banner hanging outside of their church. I mean, it's really big. This is an outdoor hallway, and you can see this just takes up the whole thing. Don't build a wall, build a larger table. So if we're talking about gratitude as either a transaction or a table, the question that emerges from that is, how do we actually build a table? What does it mean to build a table of thanks? You know, it's one thing to say it, but how do we begin to conceptualize it, put language around it, and enact it in our communities? And so that's what Grateful is about in a very real way. I want to show you how I built out a table this morning in that book. And I hope that from this you can draw things that would work in your justice organization, your calling, your leadership position, the congregation that you work in. The first thing that was interesting to me, since, as I shared last night with everyone, I was a novice in this field. I have no degrees in psychology or philosophy. I have lots of degrees in theology and church history. But as I just indicated, gratitude is absent in theology, and I had never really thought about it in relationship to church history. So this was not something I came into with a whole lot of expertise. And so when I first started thinking about how I was going to write a book on gratitude, my first thought was, how in the world can I write more than 20 pages? Because I couldn't imagine it being a book with much depth. So I gathered up all the literature I could find, which is very typical for me. This is how I always write. I fill my office with books and articles on the subject that I am approaching. I literally immerse myself in the literature, not just by reading it, but by filling my office with the pieces of paper. And so here I was at the very beginning of writing Grateful. My office is filling up with books and articles, and I start going through them. And I begin to put them in piles. Okay, so this is gratitude, and it's approaching the subject from X perspective. This is from Y perspective. This is from Z perspective. And the first thing I noticed is that there were sort of two really big piles. One was much bigger than the other, but this was the major divide that emerged in the books. And that is an enormous number of the books that are already written on gratitude are about gratitude as an emotion. Those come largely on the professional level from psychologists, and they also are the books that you might usually find in Barnes & Noble. And so these are the books about someone who has an experience that calls them to deeper gratitude. They keep a gratitude journal for about a year. It changes their whole life. Or these are the books that talk about how gratitude is good for you. What was fascinating about those books is about 80% of those books and articles were written by women. Yeah. Over here, the ethics, gratitude as an ethic, as a way of life, as a moral compass, were mostly books written by philosophers, and some, very few of them, written by historians, mostly economic historians, which was fascinating. Adam Smith actually talked quite a bit about gratitude. And so these books had titles like Gratitude, an Intellectual History. There was one book that actually had the title, The Politics of Gratitude, written by a very conservative religious right Christian guy, which I found to be really interesting, especially how much of the book I agreed with. One was called The Art of Gratitude, Oppression in the History of Western Economic Culture. You can imagine what I'm going to say next. 100%. Actually, about 95% of those books were written by men. And so here I had these two piles. The emotion books, mostly written by women. By the way, they all had pastel covers and flowers on the cover. And the ethics books with very serious kinds of hues on the front and big fonts. There was not a flower to be found. And I looked at the two piles and I thought, this is really depressing. Gratitude appears to be stereotypically genderized into these two things. And here I was, as a woman who is also an intellectual, and I looked at the books and I thought, where do I fit? What conversation do I want to have here? Do I want to write that kind of book? Or, as I'm always prone to do I want to sit over here at this table and engage these ideas? Well, very quickly I realized I wanted to do both. And there was only in my office a handful of books, less than 6, that did both. And I thought that's actually what needs to be done. Is we have to get rid of this bifurcation between our emotional life, our life feelings, and the ethical and moral practice of gratitude as a socially binding capacity of community. So that's the first way I started building this table, is thinking about these two legs, as it were. My Methodist friends, we're about to have a quadrilateral here. You will be very happy. And also then Episcopalians, you have a quadrilateral too, even though you also have a 3-legged stool, which always confuses me. So we're going to build a little quadrilateral here. And then I went and I saw the next thing that was going on with my books, is that a number of the books were about community, but most of the books were about individual practices of gratitude. And this I thought was really interesting, because the books that were about individual practice, the me of gratitude, every single one of them said that gratitude has communal aspects, and then every single one of them only talked about you keeping your own gratitude journal. So it literally assumed that somehow if you were more grateful, that you would be able to figure out how to make the leap in your own life towards the role of gratitude in community. I was actually depressed by this. how deeply privatized and individualistic these books were. A few of them did manage to do the we of community. Occasionally I found this is the only place it would show up in books about theology, is once in a while there would be a book on hospitality or some larger question like that, and it might have within it a chapter on gratitude in a community. And here I'm thinking about Christine Pohl, who has written over the years on hospitality. And she has some lovely stuff about gratitude within a book that does not have gratitude on the cover. And I just happen to know that because Christine and I went to seminary together. So I also wanted to bring these two things together. If gratitude is really good for us as individuals, and people say it's good for community, can we really pick up that piece about the good for community and make that active in the world that we inhabit now? So here's my quadrilateral. Emotion and ethic, community and personal, or public and personal. These four things, somehow building together a table of gratitude. Now I'm going to show you 8 photographs, and then we'll have a chance to talk about this. First, 2 photographs under me and emotions. So notice when you have a quadrilateral like this, you start going around, and there's 2 things in each of 4 sections. In 4 sections. So me and emotions. What does this look like in our lives? First of all, if you Google gratitude and images, that's the picture that comes up. I love this picture. First of all, it's clearly a picture of receiving. This person is open to the gifts of the universe. You get a sense of wonder and awe in this picture. Oh my gosh, this beautiful, amazing sunrise. And you also have what is true about gratitude is that it's the heart is the part of us that's furthest out in this picture. And so this is an image of vulnerability. One of the things that this picture challenged me towards this past Lent was to think of, because of course for Christians, this is also a posture of the cross. And I really have been thinking about what are the intersections of crucified shaped life and gratitude. It's a very powerful, reflective, theological place to be. We don't know much, about what this woman's religious faith, or if she has a particular tradition or not. But one thing I do know is that almost every time I show this picture, some percentage of people in the room giggle. And partly, I have discovered, it's because you have this picture on your phone. Maybe not this one exactly, but the chances are very high. I'm looking around, seeing how old people are in the room. You may have a picture of yourself doing this, but if you don't have a picture of yourself doing this at a beach or by a riverside or at a mountaintop or out in the woods, you have a shot of your millennial kid or your millennial grandkids doing this somewhere. Because this is a real posture that is all over our culture right now about awe and wonder and gratitude. And so I have this picture on my phone. It's of my daughter having climbed up a hillside outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. She went on a hike into the Shenandoahs one morning. They started before dawn. They got to the mountaintop at dawn. And there was my daughter standing on the mountain in the Blue Ridge with the sun coming up and going like this. She texted it to me at 6:30 in the morning, couldn't believe it, she was up. And she said, "Mom, I'm so grateful." And if we think about that and how powerful that is right now in our culture, so many people I know who are a little bit older, who belong to more conventional religious traditions, look down and say, oh, millennials, they don't have any sort of religious life, blah, 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 blah. But the truth of it is that they're Instagramming shots of themselves on the basis of thousands of pictures an hour, just like this, all over the world, creating images of gratitude that are easily available and deeply inspiring to their peers and friends and colleagues. And wow, I just think that that's amazing, is that this picture has become one of the sort of dominant images of our day. And it's a picture of gratitude. That gives me an enormous amount of hope. These two pictures, I put two pictures on one slide here, so I cheated a little bit. These two pictures are also images that come up when you Google gratitude and images. This man up here in the corner, I love that picture, the smile on his face, and then he's doing this, the hands over the heart. And so that becomes a real image of joy. And you can see why someone would put it under gratitude images. It's like, thank you. Thank you. And then down here in this corner, I think this is a really nice image of a woman who, the story actually is, she's a Hindu, and she was born in Chicago. Her parents were the immigrants, and she had become very disconnected from her own religious tradition. She just kind of grew up not understanding her parents' religion. And so when she got to be in her early 20s, she wanted to discover who she was in relationship to faith. And so she went on a pilgrimage out to the Ganges. And this picture was actually caught when she was having one of, there's nothing else to call it except for it's an aha moment. I mean, I would have loved to have been the photographer who caught this photograph. But you can see in her eyes that there is a sense of reverence and realization and connectedness that has emerged. And what is she doing? She's like this. And that reverence translates itself into a sense of gratitude. Now, if you have a lot of friends maybe who are from India or perhaps people who you know who are not just Hindu but Buddhists, this is a very typical posture of gratitude throughout South Asia and the Pacific Rim. Namaste, yes. And what's wonderful again is if you happen to be like me and have a lot of millennials in your life and you ever text the words thank you or grateful into your phone, what happens? The emoji comes up, that's exactly right, of this. And so it has in a sense moved from Hinduism and yoga into our general cultural stream as being the emoji for gratitude. Over the last year, as I've lectured on this and thought about the feelings of gratefulness that we each have as individuals, these three pictures just float in my mind and the postures that they represent. Abundance and vulnerability, joy and feeling the heartbeat of being grounded in this world, and appreciation and reverence. About 8 months ago, I just did that at an event, and I realized that I had a bodily prayer. And that has become one of the things that I do in the morning, is I open myself up to the gifts of the universe. I feel the heartbeat of God and my own heartbeat and ask for where joy will show itself this day. And then I just make a little bow to recognize the greatness of life and the cosmos and God and all of those things. That is very powerful. And sometimes I work with people and they say, oh, you know, I'm not really a touchy-feely person. Oftentimes, if you're like me, I'm an Episcopalian. I work all the time with mainline Protestants, the frozen chosen. You know, we have a very, very, very hard time with feelings and expressing feelings in public, and we have a very hard time with bodily stuff. And I'm now beginning to say, get over it. We just have to get over that. This is a way that I have felt the power of it, and I just submit it to you as a beautiful and amazing set of feelings that can only be that you really actually can't describe. You can only experience. So, me and emotions. That's important. And then, okay, so you have these feelings. What are you going to do with it today? The emotions are great, but if you just have the emotions, it becomes kind of a feel-good spiritual practice. And that's what my mainline friends always complain about. It's great to have these experiences, but do they translate into the world? Yes, they do. They translate in a couple different ways. On a personal level, when you feel gratitude, oftentimes we do something like this. Sometimes it's because you're feeling guilty and your mother demanded it. Grateful, I begin the book with a story about the time I got a thank you note for writing a thank you note. It came from an Episcopal bishop. And I got the note and I thought to myself, what do I do next? Didn't know. I had no idea what came next. But what this is acknowledgement. And so when you feel grateful, acknowledging the giver is a kind and polite and meaningful way to create social bonds between people. And it also, it just feels complete when it comes to gifts. And so you're actually moving from the personal into a larger circle of gratitude and saying thank you. And so that is a good thing to do, acknowledgement. There's another element of me and ethics, this personal level of moving from feeling into action, and that is what I call appreciation. And this is a vision of some forms of appreciation we have in this culture. And that is giving a small token in recognition of a great gift. Now here you're writing a thank you note for a gift. Grandma gives you a present, you send a thank you note. Somebody does something nice to you, for you, you send them a note. This is not that. Whoever said that an apple was an adequate thank you note to a teacher? I mean, think about what teachers give over the course of a year. You know, they give their heart, they've given time, they've given their own finances, they've really emptied themselves out in almost every case for those 20 or 30 or even 40 kids who are in their care. And there is no possible way that you can repay them in any way, any way for everything that they've given. So there's no possible transaction that works here. And you can't acknowledge everything because most of us don't even know all the gifts that they give. So many of the gifts are invisible. And so I use teachers as an example. Sitting in a room full of social workers and clergy, God bless you. Because you all do the exact same thing all the time. And so once in a while, the student in this case, or maybe a parishioner or a client somehow, will come back and they have a little gift. And the little gift, they just say, thank you. And if you've ever received something like that, you know how much that means. I have actually in my office all kinds of amazing little things that people have given me along the way. Little crosses, rosary beads, a couple cases, small sorts of artificial flowers. I mean, and they're just up there on my bookshelves. And what it is a collection of tokens whereby I did something, and sometimes I didn't even know I did it, and someone chose to say, I appreciate you with that. We see this a lot in our culture. It's around more than we think it is. And one of the ways that I see it on a regular basis is I fly so much. And if you fly a lot, one of the things you know that the airlines have done in recent years is that they let people who are active duty military onto planes first. And every time that happens, I always think to myself, okay, so you put your life on the line in Afghanistan, and United Airlines is letting you have an early seat on their flight. It's not an equal exchange. It's a token or a courtesy. And then the kind of person that I am, I want to jump up out of my chair and say, okay, junior high school teachers are next. Clergy come next. And I sometimes imagine myself at that gate at United Airlines, imagining all of the people who are sitting at that gate who give selfless gifts on a regular basis, and just wishing to the bottom of my boots that United Airlines would recognize all of those people too. And that's the kind of world I want to live in. And so these two things, acknowledgement and appreciation, are powerful practices that we can take on our individual lives and turn gratitude from this to this, an action, something we do in the world. And it's both. It's a feeling and a set of actions. Now, if we move from me to we, the question becomes, what do communal expressions of gratitude and emotion look like? Well, one of the things they look like is the Chicago Cubs winning the World Series. Now, we rarely think about sports events in this way, but they really are, is that, and this one was very powerfully such. When the Chicago Cubs, and I'm sorry, I live in Washington, D.C., I wish this was a picture of the Nationals, but, hopefully we all get our different turns. You guys, and Bryce Harper, I'm pissed at you all, by the way. But so here we have the Chicago Cubs, and what's just so splendid and amazing and joyful about this picture is it had been 100 years, and these people run out into the streets after their team wins, and what it's not these people saying, oh my gosh, we beat the Indians, those horrible louses. Those are, Cleveland is the worst city ever. We had to destroy them. No, it was not that at all. It was, oh my gosh, we won. I've seen the very thing that my grandparents never saw. Oh my goodness gracious, the impossible has happened. What a fantastic team. All that talent. Who knew they could ever pull it off? What luck has there been? And so what this really becomes is a communal expression of thanks. And one of the great, amazing, powerful sorts of things about communal expressions of thanks like this is they always bring people in. Sometimes people ask me, how can you tell the difference between, say, like this and there's a lot of discussion about these kinds of emotions, especially around Nazi Germany and mid-20th century fascism, because those were communal expressions of thanks as well. But what the difference is between the Nazi gathering or the fascist gathering and this kind of gathering is that the fascist gathering is thankful for only this. You can only be there if you're a certain kind of person. and have a certain kind of idea or political set of beliefs. And then you're thankful with everybody else, but the people who are standing around the arena looking in are saying, oh my gosh, I can't go in there. I would not be welcome. But here, what happened, and I have friends, some of you probably do too, I have friends who happen to have been in Chicago that week. And when this mayhem broke out, this joyful mayhem broke out in the streets of Chicago, one of the things that happened is all these people just started pulling folks in. They didn't care if you were a tourist and a businessman from Sheboygan, or you were there from Louisiana, or happened to be visiting from Oakland, California. You were part of the party. And I have friends that literally said they walked down streets like this and were given more free beer than they ever imagined, and they'd never watched a Cubs game ever. And so they were happy to be there. And it became a really powerful event in their lives, this participation in a community of joy out in the streets of Chicago, even though they weren't a Chicago Cubs fan. And that's what a communal just expression of this kind of emotion does, is it brings everybody in. It sets a huge table, and gratitude is the primary feeling. Now, that kind of thing happens very spontaneously. You can't plan it. You might not have it if you lose that seventh game. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. But we also do have more ritualized events in American culture that allow us to do stuff like this. Yeah. So every year we have graduations. And whenever you get to this point, the throwing of the caps, it's the most expected thing ever. And even when it's the most expected thing ever, you cry. Especially if it's your kid. The person you have supported for a long time, maybe know all their struggles. Doesn't matter how planned it is, the emotions still come. And they are emotions of gratitude. So a ritualized event, even an expected sort of thing, but the emotion still happens. When my daughter graduated from high school, I actually wrote about that in Grateful, and how that event transformed itself from, oh my goodness, are we going to survive, diplomas being handed out to 600 people, to really, from my point of view in this amazing auditorium, seeing a vision of America that was absolutely astonishing, of people literally from every tribe, nation, and ethnicity gathered to celebrate this moment, from people who were born in the United States and people who were born in other places, and this multitude of languages. And I'm sitting there in the upper decks, and I'm looking down, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, not only is it graduation, it's the book of Revelation. And it was just glorious and so joyful and full of gratitude. Now, what does that have to do with anything? It's great to feel this in community. And these are very binding experiences in community. If you've ever had one of these experiences, you remember it forever. It changes you. And psychologists and also sociologists say that these kinds of experiences are absolutely key to a healthy and well-functioning nation. That people who play together can work together. I think that in many cases in the United States, we've lost our capacity to play together. And that creates greater divides. So you might want to think about, does your congregation play together, or has it become all so deadly serious? Where are the moments of real communal joy and lightness? Where do those emerge? And are you fostering an environment which allows those to emerge? And then these last two shots, and we'll ask some questions. Okay, what do we do with it? How do we create public expressions of gratitude that are consequential about appreciation and acknowledgement. What happens to the emotions of gratitude when we move them from a group to being something we do together? Well, the first thing is something like this. Every single year, of course, in the United States, we have Thanksgiving. Now, I think that we've taken this a little bit for granted. We've done a couple of things to this holiday that we really shouldn't do. This is a lovely photograph, family gathered around the table. That's oftentimes how many of us think about Thanksgiving. But one of the ways that we have forgotten to think about Thanksgiving is it's not just about your individual family group. This is one of the few days a year when many, many people, the vast majority of the population of the United States, is doing the exact same thing. Is that sometime during that day, I have no idea, 85% of us, something like this, of American people will meet in groups like this around tables with families, friends, neighbors, perhaps a social service agency, Catholic Charities, or something to this effect, and they will have a meal of Thanksgiving together. And it's a publicly proclaimed holiday that we have decided as citizens of this country that once a year we will have a day set aside to celebrate the bounty of the land and the blessings that we have. There are only 10 countries in the entire world who do this. That says something about who we are. And we have forgotten how to talk about that. We kind of do it in small groups, but we don't think about what's happening in the larger picture. So we sort of handle this day a little bit in isolation to everybody else's small family grouping. And of course, it has become a run-up for Christmas. So it's become very consumerist. And actually, the consumerization of this holiday has cut into what I think is really interesting and sad is the life of the working class. Where this used to be a holiday where working class people could look forward to once a year to have that whole day off. Now, major corporations say, hey, we'll pay you time and half if you come in to work at noon so that we're ready to open the store at 3 for the big sales. And so what used to be basically a Sabbath day given by the state, which is kind of crazy and amazing all at the same time, has become a day, if you're purchasing the item, where everybody lines up to get the cheap stuff first. So it becomes a race for cheap things, or it becomes the time in which people who are at the lower ends of the pay scale give up a day of rest in order to make more money just to make ends meet. Both of those are very bad. And to begin to address that, and I think it's really fascinating that actually public pressure in recent years has stopped some corporations from opening their stores on Thanksgiving. And I cheer that, and I say more to it, you know. We have to figure out a way of working in real Sabbath time for the whole of our society, the gift of family, the gifts of abundance for everyone. And that's going to take some interesting thinking in community. The other way this works out, of course, is that people who feel blessed give blessings away. And so this is another picture of Thanksgiving, not the gathering aspect and the celebration of blessing, but instead passing blessings on to others. And so this might take the form of feeding hungry people, as it does in this picture, participating in United Way, putting together a corporate campaign on doing good in some particular need in a community. But this is a way of acknowledging blessings and appreciating everyone else in our community. Now, I love these four pictures, these four sorts of pictures working together, this whole thing. This becomes a table where we have these two different axes, feeling and action, personal and public. And you can see that all of this is part of a table of gratitude. What I discovered as I wrote this book is that most people, I certainly did, and as I started talking to other people about it, most people preference one of these things and tend to think that one thing is what gratitude is. And so when I was a little girl, I've always been this person. I mean, you can probably tell that just the way I did this. I've always been that person. If you give me a gift, it's like, oh my gosh, you gave me a gift. Oh, I'm so grateful, thank you. You know, I mean, I feel it. I feel the power of gifts very deeply. I don't even know when that started. Just, I always remember it. My mother was this person here, that being a grateful person meant you wrote the note. And so that meant that my mom and I, from early on, had a conflict of gratitude. And so I would get the gift, and Mom would say, write the note. I couldn't write the note because guess what? I felt so deeply, and I'm only like 5 years old, maybe 6, that I didn't have words to describe how I felt about the gift. So she'd give me the piece of paper to write the note, and she'd say, tell your grandmother thank you. And I'd say, dear Mimi, thank you. Love, Diana. And my mother would come by, and she would say, that's not good enough. She graded my thank you notes. And I'd look at her, and I said, what do you mean it's not good enough? And she said, tell your grandmother what you like about it. I really think this was my first ever case of writer's block because I didn't have the words to explain how I felt. And yet my mother felt that, or my mother believed that this was the gratitude. And so when I didn't write the notes, she would just kind of give up on me. Oh, my daughter is an ingrate. Welcome, baby boomers, you know. That is a huge baby boomer thing right there on that little score, right? And so anyway, that was me. This is my mom. Down here is my best friend, Teresa, and We in Emotions. Teresa is fantastic. She's a Mennonite pastor now. And anytime there's a gift, anywhere, Teresa goes and grabs her 10 closest friends and throws a party. That is her response to gifts. You find as many people as you can, and you throw a banquet. She's like the father in the prodigal son parable. She is remarkable. Her congregations love her. Oh my gosh, she is so much fun to be around. And then there are these people. Those people are usually on your outreach committees on churches. And they love doing good stuff in the world. And I remember one time I was serving as the Christian formation director in a congregation, and much of my work concentrated over here in this particular congregation to help people really develop the depth and the internality of their spiritual lives. And guess what? Where my biggest conflict was? With the people in outreach and mission. Because they felt like what they were doing was the full sum total of what it meant to be a Christian, and they thought this stuff was self-centered. And so oftentimes, if you're working in a community, you have conflicts between these different parts of gratitude, but they're all part of a whole. And so when I wrote this book, one of the pieces for me that really emerged is that I felt, oh my gosh, I'm very good at this. And then I asked myself, what am I being called to right now? So I could affirm who I was naturally, what my natural sort of gratitude inclination was. But then I was able to say, where might I need to be challenged? And interestingly enough, it was right here. And so very powerful parts of the book that I wrote become about the public expression of gratitude, about what does it mean to have a politics of gratitude, about how to develop congregations of gratitude. And so I have spent an enormous amount of time this past 2 years thinking about this, which is not my natural place to be. Instead, I moved there on purpose to have a more balanced life. So for each one of you here, you have a preference, I'm sure. Maybe you have 2 preferences, so you're more well-balanced than I was. Very few people have all 4 naturally. Very few people know that all 4 exist. And yet when you see the picture, you go, of course, that makes so much sense. So where are you, and what are you called to develop? And then the second question becomes, in your community, whether it's a congregation, a business, a larger neighborhood association, perhaps city politics, which ones of these things are obvious and strong, and which ones need development? How can you develop a whole balanced community of gratitude? And I saw your question. Yes, we'll take a few questions about this.
I can't see or read 4 quadrants, so could you explain what's in that?
Oh, that's just what I showed you. Me and emotions, me and ethics, we and emotions, we and ethics.
That's what I couldn't read.
Okay, it's just a reprise. It's a different way of depicting the slides that I just showed you. Yes, this picture is actually in the book. Yeah. So no, thank you for asking. I'm sorry about that. Sometimes I take it for granted that people back there are like Superman. Yes, ma'am, up here.
It's not a question. It's just a wonderful place. I'm always sorting out what happens at a festival. And I've read Barbara Ehrenreich's book on festival. Have you seen that? That compels me because I'm from New Orleans. And I've been here 50 years, but I'm from there. And that never can quite get nailed down for me.
Yes.
And the core of it is so life-giving.
Yes.
And there's so much wrong with the edges of it. And I can write a book practically on all of my deliberations about what is happening, the essentials of play. And it's what originally Mardi Gras is the last day before Lent begins.
Right.
And it calls for a celebration of all good, and then to say goodbye to that, to enter another spiritual phase.
Right.
So it's very deep and meaningful. It isn't, teenagers in drinking beer in the street. I mean, that's fun for them, that's what they like to do, is go get lost.
Right.
That's not the core of why it's lasted for centuries.
Right.
And so anyway, what you're saying there incorporates what's wrong with it, like the Nazi gathering is limited. And so, I mean, I love it that you can have another way of kind of holding on top of this, the real meaning, because that has to be found, and it has to be expressed. We don't dance in the streets so much at that time, as much as other times.
Well, I love that book. That Barbara Ehrenreich book is actually called Dancing in the Streets.
Yes.
And it's a wonderful book, isn't it?
It is, and
Yeah.
it's something we don't talk about very much.
That's right.
And so the baseball game is good, but there's this other thing of even being so carefree that it's almost nothing to be fun or wrong.
Right.
It's just us
Yep.
celebrating not who we are not. You mask for Mardi Gras, and it isn't who you're not. It's exactly who you want to be.
Yeah.
And so it's so fun. It's fun and fun. And yet so few people have faced this, done this, and when it's done in New Orleans, it's full of corruption. So, I mean, it's so much fun. Stratification.
Okay. There's a lot of people wanting. I know, it's a wonderful thing. And what happens is sometimes when I show this picture back here, you cannot believe, or maybe you can, how many church people have said to me over the years, well, sports is our competitor. Sports takes people away from church. You know, and that picture right there, they might be playing, but what about when they tear the benches down at UNC and burn them in the middle of the streets?
It's always that.
Yeah.
It needs to be talked about.
Right.
The problem isn't that they're burning them, but they don't talk about what's really core.
Right. Right. And we have to really wrap up. But what I want to say is you're exactly right, is that just because something has a downside like that, it doesn't mean that the central thing is not necessary and beautiful for the life and health of a whole community. And so in Grateful, I actually write about living in Santa Barbara, California, which wasn't quite New Orleans, but I got to tell you, it was one of the great festivals. It's one of the great festival cities of America. Any day, you can walk down the street and people will literally be dancing on the street, and it usually has to do with wine. It's lovely. So we have to end, don't we? Or a couple more.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Oh, he wanted to share the mic so people could hear. That was a wonderful comment about New Orleans and play, in case you missed it in the back. It was fabulous. Thank you so much, because that's a good example of this. Oh, this over here. Bob's fine. And then I kind of get over in that
A
corner.
great sadness to me in a polarized country is the really only thing that binds us communally is disaster and war. And the other thing I wanted to say is that a wonderful practice is to take excerpts of Lincoln's address to the nation on why he brought forth Thanksgiving.
Yes, the Lincoln's proclamation is very interesting. It also was related to disaster and war, which is interesting because it came. Thanksgiving had been celebrated in different parts of the United States, but it wasn't until after the Civil War it becomes a national holiday. So that's really important. And you mentioned the thing about disaster and war. The United States is in bad enough. We're divided enough right now that we're not even unified about disaster and war. A little further down in this show, if I was to be with you at a longer retreat, I have 2 whole days actually on gratitude and public life, and I have a series of tweets from Donald Trump about gratitude, and they are very divisive, and they are about Puerto Rico. And literally calling the political leadership of Puerto Rico ingrates. And so even what used to bring us together, a huge disaster in a quarter of the United States, has actually become an opportunity in this day and age to impugn a population, to demonstrate racism, what have you. But they're a great example of the corruption of gratitude. And so even now, war and disaster does not have that kind of unitive function that it once did. That's part of my passion about this project is we have very far edges of people who are very, very angry and who will probably never be brought back to any table with one another. But we also have something else that's kind of very fungible, kind of here. And I don't really want to call it a middle or centrism or moderation or any of that thing. I think it's not. I think what it is people of goodwill who are very eager to be able to face one another again and sit and have meal at table with their relatives. So that's not really moderation, but what that is a genuine desire to restitch the fabric of community so that real differences can be allowed, but real conversation can occur. And that's part of my passion about gratitude, is that at least it has the capacity to point a certain percentage of us back towards one another. And to recognize that we share all the good gifts of the land, that we share the good gifts of being here with one another, that we share in abundance. I mean, oh my gosh, we really do live in an abundant place. I was just teaching at a college on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and one of the students in the room was a young woman from Brazil. And she said she came to the United States, and she said, "You have no idea how much people in Brazil look up to the United States." And I said, "Well, why don't you share that a little bit with us? And she said, it's your justice system. And we think about our justice system as being so incredibly deeply flawed, which it is. And she actually said in the thing, she said, now that I live here, I see the problems. But she said, in Brazil. And then she started to explain what accounts for justice in Brazil. And she said, whatever the challenges and how you all are working to make your justice system better and more fair, she said, we aren't even a tenth towards that. And it was really shocking because I all of a sudden saw this system in this comparative and interesting way. And I thought, well, there is at least the blessing of us seeing that there's something wrong with our justice system. And the blessing of, the amazing people who are dedicating their lives to making it more just and more fair and less bound to things like racism. And that we have that is an incredible gift. The passions of our people to be able to engage that kind of level of unfairness, and our own hearts that can be so inspired when we see something that's so unfair, is that we go out and we try to pick that piece up and make it better for other people. And she said that does not even exist in Brazil. And see, sometimes I think that that's the capacity we've really lost, is that capacity to see these enormous gifts that even in the face of what we understand to be difficult, painful, and unjust challenges, the enormous gifts of our history, of our deeply flawed political system, of our wounded hearts, those things are all still there, even in a time when we might feel like all is lost, because all is not lost. Yes.
I want to thank you for expanding my definition of gratitude. It's very, very helpful. And also, I really like the way you implied and stated the progression of things, like with the Thanksgiving, going from that to being a sales holiday. And when you mentioned about the original meaning of gratis, the Romans, I started thinking about the origin of that word and how that was transactional, but gratis means given freely, but now we have gratuities, which are supposed to be given freely, but are actually printed at the bottom of the bill. How much you should give, 15%, 18%, 20%. So just those two things really struck me, that I'm a lifelong learner, and the kind of thing that you presented, I had no idea what it was going to be about, but the kind of thing that you presented is exactly what I love about this kind of gathering, because it expands the way I think.
Oh, thank you so much. It is remarkable how often we have turned gratus into a requirement. I grew up in part in evangelical churches, and one of the things that I thought I would always, even when I was like 17 years old, I would say this to the people who were in church with me. They would say, Jesus died on the cross so that you might go to heaven. So since Jesus gave you this great gift, you have to give your life to Jesus. And I said, well, wait a second, that's not free grace. Yeah, what it turns is, what happens is it turns into a quid pro quo of the cross. And so I would stand there at 17 and I'd say that, and of course my classmates would go, what? What are you talking about? So we have the capacity of always doing that transactional piece, even with the greatest of gifts. And so last night I was talking a lot about free gifts, and that is a socially powerful idea. Just ask Martin Luther. All of Europe changed 500 years ago because of the introduction of the idea of truly free gifts. It was a revolution. And so I guess I'm a little bit of a revolutionary. I've really tried to push it. I will share this slide back up with you all. It's hard to see in the back. Will you remind me to send this to you, Larry?
Yes.
Good. I'll send you this slide, because what this slide does is it just lists each one of the 4 areas: me and emotions, me and ethics, we and emotions, and we and ethics. And then underneath puts 3 different practices which can be used in community to develop those areas. And so under me and emotions, it's about paying attention. Someone mentioned meditation last night. Thank you very much. I think that was Bob, yeah. Meditation, contemplative prayer, those things. Reflection and awe. Under me and ethics, acknowledgement and appreciation. I talked about those 2 things in my pictures. Also creating a habit. If you create a habit of gratitude, oh my gosh, that takes you an enormously long way. We and emotions, play, festivity, how to develop those in community, celebrations, and sorry, any Presbyterians here or UCC types, letting go. Never. I know it's so hard for especially denominations that want to keep Robert's Rules in order and do it decently in order, but hey, what can I say? Sometimes you just got to let her go. And we in ethics, I think, is about seating who's at the table and how can you pull more chairs up. There is not a place in the entire Bible that when you talk about gratitude or seating people around the table is about taking chairs away. There's no ring around the rosy kind of game when it comes to God, pulling chairs out under people. It's always about more chairs. 2, sharing. How are the goods of the table passed? And then 3rd, how do you steward gifts so that they have a life beyond our own lives?
Where would you put singing?
I think singing is really powerful here. It's one of the places where people actually do let go. I see in even very traditional churches sometimes a hymn.
Singing that makes communities a group that I connect with.
Yeah. You all started with a hymn that's very powerful to me. I actually have an experience of that song being played at a friend's funeral who died of AIDS in 1989. And as soon as I hear "Great is Thy Faithfulness," it takes me back emotionally, and I literally could not sing it with you. And I was actually feeling a very deep sense of the power of that song and remembering my friend and that event from 1989. That's what a hymn did. And so that's a really amazing and beautiful thing. Yeah, a few more questions.
You offer those 2-day workshops in the D.C., Virginia area.
Oh, do I offer 2-day workshops in D.C. and Virginia area? Usually I only do them when people call me and ask me to do them. And so I just did a 2-day in Sacramento. So it's usually hosted by a church or some other organization. I should probably start doing it on my own and just have people come. But generally, a church will invite me, and then I do a longer piece. So. If anybody wants to go on a retreat after Easter, though, I'm doing one in Florida. Some of you might be up for that. It's called the Journey Conference, and it's going to be in an Episcopal campground called Dayspring, which is a lovely and kind of old Florida, very rustic camp, but still has decent beds. And it's south of Tampa by about 40 minutes. So occasionally I do a retreat type thing like that at another event. But you can look at that stuff on. That's, I think, April 25 through 27. You can look on my website. Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, ma'am.
So much of the backdrop of your book is the fact that you wrote it in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and how it was not what you expected those 100 days to be as a Hillary supporter. I'm wondering where you are seeing, especially when you're already playing with the politics of gratitude, where you are seeing some hope and some gratefulness coming when we are seeing the political left actually re-embrace religion at some extent. I'm especially thinking like Pete Buttigieg has vocally said a lot of things, like most recently You know, if Mike Pence has a problem with him, it's actually with his creator. So,
Yeah. I'm in Pennsylvania. I didn't know how much to talk about that particular aspect of the book. And one thing I have learned right now is that regionalism makes a big difference. I was just in California. There was one person who came up to me after the event and got really angry at me. And the priest of the church said, oh, you know, yeah, she gets always angry at politics, but she's also just mean. So California, and I'm right across the street from the California State House. And so people said, yeah, political diversity here means you voted for Jill Stein. So I understand region. Here's a picture of my dog, Rowan. My husband gave me this hat while I was working on the book. It says, Make America Grateful Again. The hat is purple. And so, yeah, my dog loves the hat. He carries hats around. That's a Glen of a Mall Terrier. He's kind of a rare terrier.
Is he named after the Archbishop of Canterbury?
He is. His name is Rowan. He's named after the Archbishop of Canterbury. And Rowan Williams, okay, so I'll tell this. Rowan Williams, he loves my work, which is really nice. I've gotten letters from him saying, oh, I just read this book. And when I go to England, I always stop by and chat, and we have tea. So last time I was there in Cambridge, I had tea at his house, and he pulled out Grounded, which was the book I'd written at that point in time. And he said, will you sign my book? Which is like, oh my gosh, you know. And I said, of course I will. And he said, by the way, I read it, I loved it. I love your dog's name. So I said, thank you. I'm glad you're not insulted. To your question, wow. Yeah. I did. I wrote this book during the first 100 days that Donald Trump was president when I did not feel grateful. And basically, those days, well, first of all, I tried to get out of it. I called my publisher and said, can I write about something else? And they wouldn't let me out. And so I had to write this book. And those 100 days of the beginning of 2017 were pretty much structured in the same way. And that is, I'd get up in the morning, I would read the Washington Post, I'd see what was going on Twitter, or maybe turn on television, CNN, or watch Morning Joe. And like everybody else, if you can remember back that far, the first 100 days, it was like every day was some shock. And then, it still is, and then I had to walk down into my office and write on gratitude. And so what that meant was those mornings, and then I'd spend 5 to 8 hours a day reading about gratitude. It was like the weirdest gratitude boot camp ever. And what happened was somewhere along the way, I could actually feel some shift inside of myself. Whereas I could read the Washington Post and go, oh, that's really disturbing. I need to do something about that. And wow, that actually really connects to this idea that I'm thinking about in this book. Send maybe money to a political campaign. Human Rights Campaign and the ACLU never got so much money out of out of me as they did in those months. And so, so I felt this shift, and I felt like all of a sudden I was putting things in perspective that I'd never seen before. And when I finished writing the book, it was April 29th. The first draft was finished on April 29th, 2017. And I came up, sat down at the dining table. My husband and I were chatting. We turned on the news. It was the 100th day that Donald Trump was president. And I said to Richard, oh, by the way, I turned in my manuscript today, the first draft. And Richard looked at me and he said, I think writing that book saved you. And what it really did in a very powerful way was that it helped me to see that the political tide that is ascendant is a tide of transactionalism and hierarchy and using gratitude as a political tool to frighten and oppress. And that so much of our political language right now is actually caught up around the language of gratitude. If we think about things like takers and not makers, that's a very sort of corrupted way of talking about gratitude. Is that is makers deserve things, or makers create the stuff of the universe, which is actually theologically completely wrong, for one thing. Is that we are co-creators with an abundant God, yes, but not a single one of us ever makes anything in isolation from either God or from one another. Is that all of creation is deeply relational. And so when you start talking about people as individual makers, that's just not even true theologically. It's complete turning on its head everything we know from Scripture. And then the idea that there are people who are takers. Well, the truth of the universe is that we are, first of all receivers. Not a single one of us would be sitting in this room today if we have not received the same gift, life. And so that little saying right there, that just goes theologically into the garbage can. And then you have all kinds of people talk about benefactors and beneficiaries, entitlements and people who receive entitlements. And that again that's a language of hierarchy, and it's a language of wrapped up in a sort of a transactional view of gratitude. I'm utterly convinced, and I do say in the book, since it sounds like you probably read it, I talk about, and this is not an insult to Donald Trump. This was literally an analysis of what his speeches said. And that is, he promised to, in a sense, rebuild the pyramid of American entitlements or benefactors and beneficiaries. And really an important part of, I think, his appeal was the idea that he said, I will be a pure benefactor. And you probably remember this in some of his speeches. He said, I have not accepted any money from anyone. So see there, he's setting himself up on a top of a pyramid of benefit. And when you say I have not received anything from anyone, what you're saying is I am in no quid pro quo relationship with any other organization or person who would control me. I am a free benefactor. And in my free benefaction, I will make sure that the goods, the gifts of American society, will get to, and this is the point that's just astonishing to me, the right beneficiaries. And so the actual political language was that a big part of the problem with the United States right now is the wrong beneficiaries were in the system. And so we heard things about undeserving poor, or people who were cutting in line in front of you to receive the benefits, and they are clearly taking things away from you. And people who don't deserve to be here. And so what it was is he was restructuring this American pyramid of, and so of course what you have to do if you're restructuring that pyramid, and everything makes sense in this regard, is you have to strengthen the wealthiest in the society because you believe they're the best. And if you give them all the stuff, they can be morally trusted to make sure that the goods of society get to the right people. And not only will the goods of society get to the right people, but we're also going to implement certain things in the government to make sure the wrong people can never receive benefit. And so how do you do that? The wrong people, well, if they don't happen to make it to the voting booth, too bad. Or we're going to kick out these people. Or we're going to close these doors. They can't come here and get this stuff. And so what it is, it's built on scarcity. It's built on the idea that the rich are morally better, because they wouldn't be rich unless they were. And that they have the right, by the nature of their birth and their class, to distribute the goods of society to all the rest of us, which they will do with incredible largesse and fairness if only the right people are standing in these places to receive the benefit. And so that is, and you can see what the appeal is there. I mean, it's really, really powerful. It's not about taking down the pyramid, it's about making the pyramid work for who the rich determine are the right people for whom the pyramid should work. And of course, the other promise in that quote-unquote vision is that some small number of you will achieve your great dream of rising to the top of the pyramid. And so then you too can be a pure benefactor. Now, what's fascinating is that with that whole vision, there's all kinds of stuff about the American dream, there's all kinds of stuff about race, there's all kinds of stuff about the Roman Empire, I mean, literally, that all comes into play with that. And all of that stuff, especially among the white population in the United States, all of that stuff, he didn't even have to say it, because it's all deeply coded into the culture of people with European backgrounds. So all he had to do was just kind of throw out a few signals, and if you're a white person with certain kinds of background in the US, you got it. And one of the big signals was, of course, referring to himself as a pure benefactor. Now, the Democrats had no answer for this. I don't know why it is that Democrats can't do story as well. But one of the things I thought was really interesting is that he depicted Hillary Clinton as a corrupted benefactor. See, she had received money from Goldman Sachs and the Clinton Foundation. And so what he did is he was signaling, she can't be your president because she's already in a quid pro quo relationship with other very powerful entities. And if you elect her, they're going to control the system, and everything will remain the same. And so it was the pure benefactor who was the male versus the corrupted pretend benefactor who was a woman. And of course, women are always recipients first. And she can't be president. And so you can see how all these incredibly powerful signals began playing out. And literally, once she's defined as a recipient or a corrupted benefactor, you can almost never escape from that, especially if you're a woman. And especially in Donald Trump's vision of women. I hate to get a little graphic about this, but in Donald Trump's vision, women are always the receivers. And it has to do with sex and biology. And so all of this becomes very tied up in our political structure. And that is, it becomes all about gratitude. And so at the core, and the part of the argument I make in the book, is that the invisible argument that we're having right now in American culture is about the nature of gratitude. Is it about a transaction that's hierarchically structured, based in mythologies of race and gender, and of course privilege, or is it a table where all are seated and all are fed? And what's fascinating, of course, is while this is an American mythology here, guess what is also American mythology? The Thanksgiving table. All are seated and all are fed. And so, an argument But in the last election, one side of that argument had a very outsized narrative microphone. And the question is before us, do we want to live in a country that's based on transaction, or do we want to live as a nation of tables? And here it's not Republican versus Democrat. So one of the things that I actually do talk about in the book is how Democrats also use a language of entitlement and benefits and benefactors and all this kind of stuff. And oftentimes we have, excuse me for the we, but I am a Democrat. But oftentimes what Democrats have done is they've sort of mechanized the process of benefactors and beneficiaries and sort of taken the heart out of it, and really have still imagined it as maybe a flattened pyramid, but it's still a pyramid kind of structure. It just has less distance in it. Whereas Donald Trump kinds of Republicans have a very overt pyramid with a very significant distance. So so you could have Democrats and Republicans on the side of transaction. We see that. And then you can also have Democrats and Republicans on the side of table. And so you asked me what surprised me, and that's been the big surprise. Pete Buttigieg, he's a lovely and amazing, and I just adore what he's saying right now. I think he's so fun, and I'm really glad for him. But he does not surprise me because I know lots of gay people like that. And because I've been sitting with them at table now for 25 years, listening to the stories that they bring and bear, and to have a gay person say that they are brought closer to God by being in a beautiful marriage is just something I happen to know. And so that doesn't surprise me. What really surprises me is to look up from my meal and see Rick Wilson and David Frum sitting at the table across from me. And all of a sudden, there are these Republicans who are saying, well, wait a second, we did not know. This morning, it was last night on The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, David Frum and Rick Wilson were both interviewed, and they both said that they never would have imagined 30 years ago a Republican Party that looks like the one that exists today. And then David Frum has said publicly that he's literally sorry for whatever he did that contributed for this happening. And David Frum was the guy who wrote all Bush's speeches about the Iraq War. I hated David Frum. And now he's sitting at the table with me, and that really surprises me. And you know what the worst part of it is that I surprised David Frum. And I actually know that because we've become friends. And once in a while we send each other email, and he says, you know, I never knew you existed, but now I read your books, and I love your Twitter thread, and I'm so glad your voice is in the world. It's like I'm thinking to myself, this is David Frum. How does this happen? And so this for me has become the most astonishing and beautiful and amazing gift of these days, is that there really truly are people sitting at the table that we would have never imagined, and people who were invisible to us before because we thought that they were our enemies. And guess what? All sorts of unlikely people have wound up being our friends. And then the strangest bit of it all is my own brother has disowned me. He did after Charlottesville, when I could not believe that on social media my own brother was saying that the Heather Heyer deserved to die because she was on the side of Antifa. And I came back at him on social media and I said, our dead parents are ashamed of you, which is true. I know that. I talked to my mother about it. And so, you know, I did come at him very hard, but I thought that, you know, he really deserved it. But I was the elder sister, and he's the younger brother, and so there's all that sibling rivalry stuff. And after that, he decided he never wanted to speak to me again, and he has not since Charlottesville. And so the really, really big, weird surprise for me is how desperately I want my brother to be back at the table. And how much it hurts that he's not there. And so our tables are both bigger than we ever imagined, with very surprising guests sitting across from us and next to us, and other people who are dreaming about a table. And then I think that probably all of us bear in our heart someone who's not at the table, who has chosen a very different path, and whom we wish could sit at that table, and that the chair is still there for them. So those are the surprises. It's kind of a long answer, but gosh, it is also a really, it's so deep in the heart of where we are today. And I really appreciate you asking the question. Thank you. Is it time to go? Oh, okay. I thought it was. Okay. But here, this gentleman.
Yeah, it seems to me that taking a place at the table might require real transformation.
Yes.
It might require that I turn loose this delusion that at least I still have some of self-sufficiency.
Yes.
It might require me, as a member of this culture, to distance myself a little from my idea of rugged individualism. It might require that transformation. I have to give up something then in order to be transformed. I have to give up my idea that I deserve where I am every day. And not, in order to follow Jesus' words and take my rightful humble place along the table, and maybe someday be as friend with my
Right.
I have to give up something to follow those words,
Yes.
and that can be painful.
Yeah.
It's so part of our culture. Competition.
Right.
You're right, the Democrats have not studied recognition with the corporate world. The corporate world is competition. The corporate world is rugged individualism. I have to distance myself from this whole atmosphere and start to step out on empty space
Yeah.
with nothing but the gospel. Can the gospel compete against rugged individualism as our real religion? Because I think that is the religion of the United States, against which Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Judaism. I don't know if they're doing a good job of competing against rugged individualism nowadays.
Well,
I have to give up something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And every story, those of you who have been preaching this season certainly know this, is that the texts have been a lot of texts about people having to make choices. And you think about the rich young ruler. I share often on the road the story of Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus come down out of that tree. So you have to, there are things that Jesus says, you know, if you're going to sit here, you need to do this. And it's fascinating who he directs that to. It's always directed towards people who have power and privilege. Whereas when Jesus feeds the 5,000 people in the big field, all he does is pass the bread. Is that everybody's at the table. There's no demand there. And what we can assume is that all of those people are pretty poor. But then in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor. And so there are certain people that there are no demands placed on at all in order to sit at the table. They're just sitting at the table. And then there are other people who Jesus does say, if you're going to do this, this is how you follow me. This is how you take up your seat. And so then you have to know where you are in that story. And, you know, that's hard to face. The other thing you said in that was that the gospel, how can the gospel face down this stuff? Well, 2,000 years ago, one would have wondered how possible it would have been for the gospel to face down the Roman Empire. But the gospel became such an incredible challenge to the Roman Empire that the empire had to appropriate the gospel in order to survive. And so we get Constantine, the master appropriator of all time. And what I wonder now, in the way that you say that you set up the question, we have at this moment that we're being freed from that appropriation. You know, if going to church is not just the culturally accepted thing to do, if having a religious tradition is not just what you're born with, that we literally all have to choose, that our churches, our religious organizations are smaller than they used to be. We've clearly lost privilege and entitlement within the larger cultural picture. So maybe we're being freed from that appropriation, and in that freedom, we regain a sense of our strength, our identity, and our power, and can speak into the cultural moment differently. So those are some of the hopes that I have with this. And we clearly see that the transactional pyramid type of politics is appropriating some forms of Christianity in a very powerful way right now. Whereas there are other other voices that are emerging who are talking about the table. And it's not so much about a table cannot literally appropriate anybody. Everyone just comes to a table, and everyone brings their own stories. And so I think that that's one of the struggles that's going on in our culture right now. And I'm very grateful for it because it makes things very clear. And you say it's hard to give some things up. Yeah, and it calls us all to be much more self-aware and to think about how our lives are complicit with these structures, to sever what we can, and I have lots of friends who are doing that. Lots of people I know who are going into retirement who are literally looking at their retirement portfolios and saying, where are the responsible places to invest? Where I'm working for a kind of global common good and not just lining my own pocket. And people literally making choices that way. Not to toot my own horn, my husband takes care of these things in our family. But literally, when Trump became president, he said, I bet that the stock market is going to take off. And I said, yeah, probably so. And my husband said, I don't want to make money on it. And so my husband called our investment guy and said, I want you to rebalance our portfolio in X, Y, Z ways because I don't want to make money off of Donald Trump. And the portfolio guy in Boston was like, are you sure you want to do this? You know, come on, over here. Are you sure you want to do this? And my husband said, yes. And so that was the choice that we decided to make as a family. So we still have investments. We're not stupid. We know we need it. We want to be able to have a decent retirement, just the same way everybody else does. But we have tried self-consciously not to make money off of the backs of people who are suffering at this moment. And boy, you know, there are certain things that are kind of going crazy in portfolios because of policies that are now put in place about the environment, about criminal justice and other things. So these are the choices that you have to make if you're a person of privilege. And so it's okay, make them. Yeah, and be of good cheer. Don't worry about it. Jesus is with you. Yes.
I think it's interesting that you chose to draw a round table instead of one with a head of the table.
Yes,
and
purposeful.
Could you speak to that?
Just purposeful. I one time got fired because I took rows of chairs out of a classroom and put in round tables. And the dean told me, you can't teach with round tables. You will lose the order of the classroom. And I said, watch me. And so is that round tables are about sharing. They're round. There's no head. No head.
One over here, I think.
Okay.
Lady.
Yes.
That was my question. I'm glad you answered it now. asked it, but I did have another one. So, can we approach voting for politicians in a table format?
Oh, can we approach voting for politicians at a table rather than transactional format? I hope so. There's a lot of pressure towards transactional choices around voting, and I kind of get this all the time as people ask me, who are you supporting for primary, Democratic primary? And I think I've given money to like 6 or 7, maybe 8 of them now. Well, I'm supporting goodness, I say, and so, but the idea we have is in our form of democracy is you pick one and you stick with it, and that's your team, and that becomes a very transactional kind of thing. By giving money to a variety of candidates and a variety of causes, one of the things I'm doing is just saying, I can see any one of you as being a person that I want to be a president, the political voice, the policy shaping voice of the nation over the next 4 years. And I don't give money in order to get something back in return, because if that was the case, I'm really bad at it. I didn't give money to Barack Obama so I get an invitation to the White House. And so just kind of unhinging those kinds of transactional responses from our own brains is the first step of that. And then, of course, holding our politicians accountable to when transactionalism is clearly visible with the people they pick, the votes they make, all these kinds of things. And so organizations of transparency that keep accounts of that are very important to support. If you're a writer, journalist, a person who has some sort of social voice, continuing to make those cases. Today, for example, the Senate confirmed as the new Department of Interior guy, a fellow who used to be a lobbyist for the oil industry. Now, if we don't think that that's a quid pro quo, nothing is. That's about transaction. And so everybody needs to make noise about that. And everybody needs to keep an eye on that guy. And even if we can't do anything about it tomorrow or the next day, what hopefully will happen is in the future that becomes a model for how you don't do democracy. And you just say, okay, it happened there, and we're going to make sure that it never happens again. And perhaps put policies in place that prevent those sorts of things from happening, and certainly voting for better people who will not make choices like that. And so all those things, I think, begin to help us think about what it would be like if we lived in a politics that really finally got rid of quid pro quo, or at least as much as is humanly possible, and moved towards the setting of a common good table. Is basically what I'm calling for. So thank you. That's a great question.
Okay. We've had Diana going for like 2 hours now. So can we just get one final question?
This gentleman had one.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want, the question is, if you think our faith communities are moving away from quid pro quo when they preach with race and stuff, it's not to earn it, and also reminding what that interaction between 5-year-old and her mother. Do you think our families are moving away from quid pro quo? Are we still saying I think we thank somebody for it? Being a grandfather.
Right.
When I give to my grandkids, I don't expect.
Oh, God bless you. He says, be a grandfather. When he gives a gift to his grandkids, he does not expect a note. I have literally had people come up to me at events that I've done this year who are grandparents who say, my grandkids never send me a note. And that makes me really hurt. And I say, well, then whose problem is that? And basically, people say, well, it's my daughter, she never wrote thank you notes either, and now she's not teaching her kids to write thank you notes, and it's her problem, or it's the 5-year-old's problem. And I said, I think it might be yours. I said, because really, do you expect a note if you give a gift? And people will look at me and said, oh, And so I do think a lot of this work, as I said last night, is really taking a very, honest and gracious, sort of mix those two things together, assessment of our own understanding of these things. And look at our attitudes about gratefulness and gifts and what we think we deserve. I gave a couple examples of myself last night with the book blurbs. One of the things I've learned in the last couple years is never, never, never look at Amazon rankings. Because that's about pyramids and quid pro quos and entitlement. My book deserves to sell more. I've been writing longer than that person who's just written her first book. And so that becomes me, not the problem of the book buyers or that other author. And so then that becomes the spiritual assessment. When it comes to our communities, those of you who are pastors, please look at your congregations through these eyes and see where quid pro quo exists in your congregations. It's not only sort of issues of, I'm going to give this money and I expect you to have the same liturgy for the next 40 years until I'm dead, kind of quid pro quo. But it's also it's just amazing how often quid pro quo floats around churches in very subtle and even ways that seem innocuous. People think, oh, if we introduce this kind of music, then young people will come to our church. If we do this, then this will be the result. It's a targeted gift. And what you want is, you don't really want that kind of music in your church. What you want is, you want the bodies in your church. And you're trying to think about how to get the people in the door. And guess what? When that is in place, the people who you want to come in the door know it. Because the next thing is, they come in the door, and then you say, oh, by the way, can you teach Sunday school? Because I'm tired. And see, so often evangelism and church growth are all structured around things like quid pro quo.
Even giving. I worked with a stewardship committee that said, we won't give any more money to somebody who doesn't send us thank you notes.
Oh my gosh.
Seriously.
Ouch.
And that included the denominational mission.
The other thing is, capital campaigns are often that way. I was part of a church one time that had a huge need, millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And what they did is, they arranged givers according to rank. And so you could give, and you could be an angel giver or an archangel giver. Then, of course, what happened at the end of the year, when the capital campaign, all the results came in, they published a booklet, and everybody in the congregation was listed according to the status of their gifts. That sounds like the Kennedy Center. You know, I go to the Kennedy Center and I look and I see how many senators give money at what rank, because I want to see who's cheap in Congress, you know. And I think to myself, what am I doing? You know, everybody should just give anonymous gifts all the time. So anyway, check your congregations and look for stuff like this. Are people using gifts to get something in return? And then, what's your responsibility in terms of leadership? In terms of, how do you teach around these things? How do you preach sermons on this? Do people really understand gratitude? Are people developing personal lives of deep gratitude? And if you start getting this conversation going in a congregation, would it change things? I get good reports on that from people. This year, a friend of mine who runs who is the pastor of a congregation and the congregation has a lot of complaints. No congregation ever is complaining. But it's a congregation that is particularly given to complaining. She literally opened her email and she said, every day, everybody in this congregation is welcome to send me something you're grateful for. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to gather up all the emails. I'm going to take the names off of them at the end of Lent, and I'm going to create a big mosaic of gratitude. And so every day she's getting dozens and dozens and dozens of notes from her whole congregation about things they're grateful for, things that might have happened with the church, but more often they're things that are happening out in their other parts of their lives. And she says, it's turned my inbox from, would you please stop doing XYZ on Sunday, to this sort of bountiful vision of gratitude. And she says, it's been the best Lent ever. And so what they're looking forward to on Resurrection Sunday is this beautiful sort of mosaic, this joyful announcement of endless and bountiful Thanksgivings that the congregation has been through all during Lent. And so there's little things, and they can be very powerful in life of a community. So thank you so much.
Thank you.